Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordy,
And I'm Brad.
and welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I research a case, and Brad here, and potentially you guys.
Don't know a damn thing about it.
So, hopefully, you guys have had a wonderful week since the last time you heard from us. It was a pretty eventful week for us. Um, Last weekend was actually my birthday weekend. I turned the big 2-8, which is actually shocking to some people because since I was about 19, I've been getting that, oh, I thought you were like 32, which I've never been able to determine if it's a compliment or if it's, I know it's meant as a compliment, I think, but I don't know if I should take it as a compliment. But you know what? I am approaching 32, but I just turned 28. It was a good time. We actually went up to Horror Hound Weekend in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm sure people who have been listening a while know that Brad and I are pretty huge horror fans. And that is a yearly tradition. We get a bunch of friends, we drive up, have a good time, really cool, really chill environment. But on the way there, so it's a 4-hour drive. On the way there,
4.5 hour drive.
4.5 hour drive, and 30 minutes from the hotel, the universe gifted me for my birthday a blown out transmission.
Well, we thought it was a blown out transmission to begin with.
But that's a little later here in the story, and I promise we'll get to the case eventually. But this is a heavy case, so you guys deserve a little bit of a reprieve, honestly. So anyway, 30 minutes before the hotel, getting to Horror Hound, transmission goes out on the interstate, starts puttering along, pushing the gas pedal all the way to the floor, doing nothing.
Also, we're in Cincinnati traffic, so anybody that's been in Cincinnati traffic knows what I'm saying when I say if it could be bad, that made it a lot worse.
Thankfully, we were only 30 minutes from the hotel, though, so we were able to limp there. And I decided, you know what, I'm not going to let this ick my yum. So I ignored it the whole weekend. It was an amazing time. We actually ran into a listener. He stopped us while we were walking through the exhibit hall, and he was like, I know you guys because every time when I come home from work, my husband falls asleep to either you guys or another podcast. And I was like, oh my God. So it's crazy to be like recognized in the wild because, I mean, who are we? But it is, if you are listening to that, I think you know who you are. You fall asleep to the podcast and your husband comes home and listens to it as well as you fall asleep to it. Hello.
And we appreciate you listening.
Yeah, really appreciate you listening. Hopefully you're listening to this episode. If you are, it was so nice to meet your husband. And yeah, thank you for listening. Other than that, crazy weekend. We actually dress up as slutty camp counselors from Friday the 13th.
There's 5 of us.
And when I tell you, I've never seen people go crazy because we do cosplay too. For anyone who is not a longtime listener, we do a lot of cosplay, and this is a very simple Amazon buy, casual cosplay, and people went knucking futz for it. And I don't know what it is about them, but it was a good time.
I think it's a lot of people love Friday the 13th, and even if you're not a big horror fan, you know about the camp counselors and their plot.
You do, and I think that is one of the big things. Friday the 13th is my favorite franchise. It holds a very special place in my heart. And so, yes, everyone loved it. We loved it. We took so many photos. It was such a good time. But then Sunday came to drive home, and so I was driving home from Cincinnati in the middle of a rainstorm without a transmission during rush hour downtown traffic. And also another fun little fact about me, I actually have severe anxiety. It's actually a serious condition. And so you can imagine what it's like doing that. But I think I held my own pretty well. We made it 4.5 hours back home without a transmission.
It was not 4.5 hours back home. It actually took about 6.5 hours to get back home because going up hills, we could only do 20 miles per hour.
And yes, so it was a stressful time had by all, but we made it.
And Jordy done great. I have to say, I was probably more nervous for him than he actually displayed doing the drive.
I was about to say, actually, the whole ride there, no one honked at us. So appreciative to all the drivers who hopefully understood I'm doing my best here. But one good thing that came out of that is my new birthday present to myself was I got a brand new car. So fresh off the lot. I've only had it 3 days now, 4 days now, and it's great. So, I always say everything happens for a reason. So the universe tested me by making me drive 3 states without a transmission to grant me a newer, improved car. Anyway, that was our week and our weekend. Hopefully you guys had a little bit easier weekend. And with that, hopefully also you guys have had time to digest last week's episode because I know it was a rough one. And this one is also equally rough. So now that we have that fun little palate cleanser, I guess we just got to jump right into it because also, if you can't tell by the title, this is part 2 of a 2-parter of the serial killer Randy Kraft that we started last week. So if you haven't listened to last week's episode, highly recommend you do. You don't have to, but it'll help speed. It'll help you better understand where we're coming from here. So we are talking about Randy Kraft, aka the Scorecard Killer, aka one of America's worst and most prolific serial killers in history. Like I said, part 2 if you haven't listened to part 1. But in summary, Randy Kraft terrorized the freeways and interstates around California as he would abduct young men, torture and assault them before killing them and dumping their bodies out in the open to be found. Now, in total, he is estimated to have claimed anywhere from 50 to 70 plus victims from 1972 to 1983. He would eventually earn the nickname the Scorecard Killer due to keeping a list in his car where he would mark down each one of his kills. Now, he was actually originally called the Freeway Killer, but that actually had to be changed for a reason we'll discuss here in a little bit. So, where we last left off at the end of part 1, it's the beginning of 1975, and Randy has just claimed his 14th victim, I think. That's how crazy it is, lost count. Victim, and this one actually got him caught and investigated by officers. They were so convinced he was the killer that they wanted to arrest him right then and there for the latest murder. But due to a severe lack of physical evidence, the DA declined to press charges and he was let go to continue his reign of terror for another 8 years. So with that, let's jump into it. So Randy was let go, had the charges dropped against him in relation to Keith Crotwell's murder due to lack of evidence, and this was in May of 1975. Now, this did seem to be enough to scare Randy into stopping his murders, at least for a time. He is not known to have killed again during the remainder of 1975, and instead was dealing with problems in his personal life, including his deteriorating relationship with Jeff Graves, his partner of several years at that point. Following Randy's run-in with the law, the two's relationship completely crumbled as the two grew to despise one another. And horrible, if you don't want to let it build up until eventually it turns to resentment and despising each other. And that's kind of what they did. It kind of rotted them from the inside out. And if you listen to part 1, you'll know that their fights often correlated with Randy going on drives at night to, clear his head and cool down, which always correlated with another body being found the next morning. So now, Randy was the one stating he wished to be in a monogamous relationship with Jeff, and Jeff stated that he wanted to be the one in an open relationship. The roles were reversed in part 1.
Yeah, so they totally switched on that.
Yeah. So now that he was like, oh, I almost got caught for this murder, well, maybe it's time to settle down
I need to stay home a little bit more.
and quit running the roads. Now, this often led to the two getting into horrible fights on the daily, and since he wasn't taking his anger out by murdering innocent boys and men at this point, Randy began to complain of intense headaches during this time and insomnia, leading to him eventually being diagnosed with hypoglycemia. He was also laid off from his job and arrested on a misdemeanor charge of, quote, lewd acts after trying to pick up an undercover cop at a cruising park.
But he wanted to be a monogamous.
Yeah, but he wanted to be monogamous. Now, all these things back to back caused a rage to build up inside of Randy, a rage he wanted to let out on one of his victims. But he restrained himself out of fear of being caught. Now, most of us take our rage out on, I don't know, anything. But Randy is the type, when he gets angry or frustrated, he wants to go out, torture, assault, and murder people. And the fact that all this is building up and he's not letting it to be let loose, it's like a ticking time bomb. And as we'll see here in a minute, whoever gets it's going to be worse than any he's done before.
And what he's done before is really, really bad.
So the final straw of 1975 was around Christmas when Jeff Graves officially called it quits and ordered Randy to move out of his apartment, which Randy reluctantly agreed to do. Now, following this and having reached his breaking point, Randy would go on to commit his next murder on January 1st, 1976. And this one will be by far his most brutal and horrific murder, even according to every investigator involved. In the early morning hours of the new year, a horrifically mutilated body would be found tied to a tree just off of Ortega Highway. The victim would be identified as 22-year-old Mark Hall, a young man who disappeared from a bar earlier that night while out celebrating New Year's. Right away, it was very clear that this had been a prolonged and very brutal killing. Honestly, trigger warning for how brutal it is. So, it was clear a lot of anger went into Mark's murder, as the killer had started by torturing him for hours. His legs were described as having deep gashes and being, quote, shredded, and it was determined his killer had used a broken beer bottle to scrape up and down his legs. He was found nude, and he had been sodomized before being castrated and having his own penis rammed inside his rectum. He suffered extensive burns all over his body, including his chest, scrotum, back, nose, and cheeks. But most disturbing of all, a car lighter had been used to burn out his eyes, all while he was still alive. A later autopsy would determine that his final cause of death was from asphyxia after his killer rammed so much dirt down his throat. So yeah, really horrific murder. And as even investigators said, like, this was the most horrible murder he is known to have committed. And yeah, it's just reading it and researching it, it's like, I can't even imagine. Now, despite the horrific crime scene, nothing in the way of physical evidence to lead back to the killer was found, and his case quickly grew cold. Following this, Randy again went on a brief hiatus as he actually began a new relationship, this time with a 19-year-old named Jeff Sealing. Now, the two had met in the summer of 1975 during a party, and they rekindled their friendship following Randy and Jeff Graves breaking up. Randy was said to have taken the young Jeff under his wing and began to teach him about gay culture, how to navigate gay bars, and to, quote, always be on guard from men who want to hurt you. The two were said to have a good relationship, surprisingly, often going out and picking up other men to have threesomes with, and Jeff later stated Randy never showed violent tendencies towards him at all and was always gentle. It's due to this relationship that police believe Randy again went on another long killing hiatus and was not known to have killed again until December 10th, 1976. So almost a year. He only killed one person almost for 1976, and it is fascinating to see how the different points of Randy's life correlates to how frequent he murders people. So almost a year, from January 1st to December 10th, 1976, Randy isn't known to have killed anybody. But even if he wasn't killing people, that didn't mean the bodies stopped piling up around the area. During this time, over 50 more young boys and men would be found murdered and dumped along the California freeways, to the point it was considered an epidemic as 2 or 3 were being found almost daily for several months. Now, while it was obvious that they had been murdered, the terrifying thing investigators realized was that there was more than one serial killer operating in the area. Due to the very slight differences in MOs, investigators concluded that at least 2 different serial killers were operating in the area, both targeting young men, mainly homosexuals, and both being described as lust killers. But what investigators didn't know was there weren't 2 serial killers in the area. There were actually 3. So this is kind of a bit of a side note, as we don't have time to go into it today, or this episode would be 3 hours long. And so I just want to mention it because it does play a big role in why Randy was able to get away with his murders for as long as he did. Some of you may know this. A lot of people actually don't know this, but it's probably the most insane, terrifying, so bizarre true crime fact that you'll ever hear. So, during this time period in California from 1962 to 1983, there were 3 separate serial killers, all operating isolated from one another, all of them targeting the exact same locations, the exact same victims, almost the very exact same MOs. Patrick Kearney, William Bonin, and finally Randy Kraft were all at one point known as the Freeway Killer before they each had to be given their own unique names to avoid confusion once it was discovered that there were 3 of them.
It's too bad they didn't pick up each other.
Yeah, and that's the thing. This is not that big of an area.
Yeah, I mean, they had a chance for that to actually happen.
And some people, I think, I didn't get too far into it, but there are some reports they stalk the same bars, so it is more than likely they could have interacted with each other.
That's like a movie right there. 2 serial killers. Who comes out alive?
But it's not just 2, it was 3 at the exact same time. I mean, it's not rare for like there to be more than one serial killer, but the fact that it's not just 1, 2, or 3, it's the fact that all 3 are
Targeting homosexuals
the
and are homosexual men.
and the exact same top. So it would be like if there were 3 serial killers that all targeted pretty blonde women at the exact same time. So they are literally like one picks up one and 20 minutes later another comes and picks up one. And that causes so much confusion for investigators, especially since their MOs are also very similar about dumping bodies on the side of the freeway. So by 1975, all 3 were uncaught and at the height of their respective murder sprees. Combining the 3 would claim almost 200 victims known. Due to how similar the 3 operated, it made it extremely difficult for investigators to determine which victim belonged to which killer. Something that even to this day is not 100% certain with certain victims. So that's another thing that took so long is like they're not tracking one killer, but they're all so similar. It's like, okay, well, now we got to try to figure out the timeline of was it this freeway killer, or this freeway killer? And that is one thing that caused so much confusion because it's like Randy's not killing during this time, but the other 2 are, and it's the exact same MO and victim type. So police are assuming it's someone like Randy that's killing, but then Randy's like, I was here this whole time. So very confusing, very crazy, very terrifying.
Very lucky for those killers because that confusion let all of them continue on much longer than they probably would have.
And I was about to say, pure luck, especially on Randy's part, allowed for him to operate and only added to the confusion as his own victims began getting lumped in with those claimed by Patrick and William. And that's actually where I'm going to end it, discussing those 2. I know y'all are probably like, WTF, you can't just drop a bombshell like that and move on. But I do promise I'm going to cover both of those very, very soon. Not right away because kind of got to break it up because that's a lot and it's really heavy. But they are coming in the near future and we will connect all of them, I promise. For the time being, contain yourself because today we're here to talk about the final freeway killer and probably the worst. So while bodies continue to pile up around the freeways throughout 1976, Randy lived a pretty normal and quiet life as he and Jeff settled into their relationship. That is until December 10th. What happened, if anything, to make him kill again is not known, but that night, 19-year-old Paul Fuchs would finish eating dinner with his family before running out the door to catch a ride with friends, and he would never be seen again. Now, he seemed to have vanished into thin air despite his parents' best efforts to find him. They did reveal he was gay and may have ended up at a gay bar at some point the night he vanished, but no one knew for sure. His body would never be found, and it's unknown what actually happened to him specifically, although we know he was a victim of Randy Kraft due to his name and date being listed on Randy's scorecard. Again, following this, Randy would go on another long hiatus from killing, and he wouldn't claim another victim until almost 16 months later. In the early morning hours of April 16th, 1978, the body of an 18-year-old Marine from Camp Pendleton named Scott Michael Hughes was found dumped in a ditch off the freeway outside of Anaheim. Although fully clothed, a further autopsy would reveal that his killer had tortured him by slitting open his scrotum and removing one of his testicles before strangling him with his own shoelaces. It was also discovered that he'd been drugged with Valium. A few months later, on July 11th, the body of 23-year-old Roland Young was found dumped along the San Diego freeway. He was found nude, having been castrated before he was stabbed to death. Now, this one was a little different because abrasions on his body suggested that he had actually been pushed from a high-moving vehicle. Now, from here, Randy seemed to be ramping up his murders once more, and again, the exact reason is not known, but you can tell from the pattern at this point that his murder sprees correlate to him not doing well in life, where he got into an argument with his partner. So you're like, what happened that finally set you off? Again, just 8 days after the last murder, the fully nude body of 20-year-old Marine Richard Keith was found dumped in the middle of the freeway. So not on the side this time, in the middle of the whole ass freeway. His body had been pushed again from a moving vehicle, and the road was covered in a 90-foot stretch of blood and flesh from where Richard's body had bounced as it was pushed out. Although he bore signs of being beaten and tied up, his actual official cause of death was from an accidental drug overdose, insomnia medication. And if you remember, Randy Kraft had insomnia around this time. And that's another thing, too, we have to remember. Randy Kraft was caught. He never admitted to anything. So a lot of this is people just being like, how do we know it's him? Well, this. He had insomnia. He was diagnosed with it. He got medicine. And then right around that time, one of his victims was drugged with it to the point they died.
And he also had a scorecard in his car with all of their names and the times when he killed them.
And as we'll see in this episode, he also had a lot more. So it's like, Randy is like, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. So now actually by this point, a task force had been formed to investigate the freeway killer or killers. Because like I said, at this point, 60 men are being killed in a year. And now they're finally like, okay, we actually do have to come together and figure this one out, because the knowledge that at least one killer was operating in the area was now public, and everyone was now fully aware, like, yes, there's a serial killer on the loose, but investigators kind of kept it close to the chest that, oh, it's actually 3, but... So with this, investigators began working around the clock to try and catch them. Now, they were successful in their efforts after managing to capture one of the killers in 1977. But Randy was still on the loose, and any fear he had of being caught seemed to disappear as his victim count rose higher and higher. 3 weeks after Richard's murder, on July 6th, a 23-year-old hitchhiker named Keith Klingbeil was found in a ditch off the Interstate 5 freeway. But this time something was different. Keith was actually alive when he was found. He was quickly rushed to the hospital, but would sadly die not long after arriving without being able to tell anyone what had happened. It would be discovered that he had also died from an accidental drug overdose, and that, horrifically, his nipples had been burned off with a car's cigarette lighter. 2 months later, on September 29th, the body of 20-year-old Richard Crosby was found off the side of Highway 70, again having been strangled with his own shoelaces and his nipples burned off with a car lighter. Now, Randy's final victim of 1978 would be on November 18th, when the nude body of a 21-year-old truck driver named Michael Enderbyton would be found dumped along the side of the I-6. His murder, also like Mark Hall's, seemed to be particularly rage-filled and brutal. He had been tortured by having his eyes and nipples burned out with a car lighter, sodomized with a large foreign object, castrated, and finally murdered by being strangled. And again, it's kind of like, what was pissed you off so much to focus so much hurt and rage on this victim?
I mean, all of them are bad, but he seems to go through phases where it's like he'll do one thing like burning their nipples off. You know, he went through a phase of like sodomizing people with tree limbs and stuff. So, I mean, he's a horrible person, but then it seems like all of a sudden he does just go overkill and does everything to like one person, which is absolutely terrifying.
And again, correlates usually with how bad a fight is with the partner or something like that. So something happened to make him enraged. Now, Randy would go on to claim at least 4 more victims starting on June 16th, 1979, when the body of a 20-year-old Marine named Donnie Crissell was found along the 405 freeway, having been strangled and tortured with a cigarette lighter before his death. 2 months later, the dismembered body of a 21-year-old English tourist named Keith Jackson was found wrapped in trash bags and dumped in a dumpster behind a Long Beach gas station. Now, this is a little different. This is kind of a different MO. And actually, one of the other freeway killers, one part of his MO that was unique was he eventually became known as the trash bag killer, Patrick Kearney, because he did have an affinity to put his victims in trash cans or trash bags and when he dumped them along the freeway. However, by this point, he's arrested, and investigators actually know or highly suspect that Randy is responsible for Keith's death because an entry on his scorecard that simply read England 76, referring to Keith being English. Now, only Keith's head and legs would ever be found. 2 weeks after this, on September 16th, the dismembered body of a 19-year-old named Gregory Jolly would be found dumped along the freeway. His belongings would later be found at Randy's house. So it does seem he kind of switches his MO up a bit too. The cause of death is not always the same. It's mainly strangulations, but some he stabbed to death, some were a drug overdose. Horrifically, if you listen to part 1, some were killed with tree branches, being impaled on tree branches essentially. And now he's dismembering them. And so that is also part of the confusion, is that he didn't have a set MO like how he murdered his victims. And so that also kind of goes against the grain of established serial killer psychology. Now, his final victim of 1979 would be on November 18th when he would abduct a 15-year-old named Jeffrey Sayer as he walked home from the bus stop in the area of Westminster. Again, although his body was never found, the date he disappeared and the words, quote, Westminster date, were found written on Randy's scorecard. He also disappeared less than a mile from the home where Randy's parents were now living. Now, Randy would claim his next victim on February 18th, 1980, when 19-year-old Marine Mark Marsh would disappear while hitchhiking home from his base. His nude body would be found off the side of Templin Highway. He had been sodomized, and his hands had been cut off. Following this, it would be several more months before Randy would kill again. But during that time, investigators were closing in on another one of the freeway killers. William Bonin would be arrested on June 11th, 1980, and charged with several murders related to the freeway killer. Now, the murder the investigators actually pointed as him being responsible for, and the one they actually officially arrested him on and charged him with, was the murder of Marine Eddie Moore, who, if you listen to part 1, you may remember, was actually one of Randy's earliest victims, not William's. And so, again, the confusion, they were so similar, they were like, oh, we think William killed this guy. And it's like, actually, that's another freeway killer you have yet to catch. Now, police proudly announced that they had caught the freeway killer. Little did they know, they only caught one of the 2 remaining freeway killers. Now, with 2 down, Randy stood as the last of the 3 killers, and he would go on to claim many more lives.
The thing is, right there, he could have stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And they would have probably blamed the other 2 for eternity that they killed all of those guys.
Oh, yeah, it would have definitely been one of those things like on, because I'm really big into like Reddit unsolved mysteries and stuff, it would have definitely been one of those types of cases where it's like, was there a third freeway killer? Here is the evidence, like this victim and this victim, because that's still a huge thing. Like, it's kind of a unspoken secret that John Wayne Gacy had an accomplice. And you won't see that many, like, but if you just compare the, like, the day they disappeared and, like, police records, it's impossible he killed some of the victims found buried in his house. And so you can look into that on your free time. But yeah, if Randy had, I hate saying this, if Randy had been smart and was just like, oh, there was another one and he actually got pinned on a murder I did, I'll stop here and get away with it. And he'll been one of those things where it's like, was there or wasn't there a third freeway killer? But thankfully, he did get caught eventually, and he is being punished. So starting in the summer of 1980, Randy traveled to Portland, Oregon for a business trip, and while there, he would claim several more victims. So now he's going out of state.
And that's a good way to show you're a killer when all of a sudden you go somewhere and people die in the area you've visited.
And that's also a really good way to get caught because now you're branching out and people are going to start noticing more. You don't have two other killers operating in the area to kind of cover your crimes up.
Especially if your MO of killing moves up to a new area.
So they're going to know you're mobile. And the fact that you're doing it on a business trip means there is a paper trail. So on July 17th, 1980, the body of 17-year-old Michael O'Fallon was found dumped off the side of a road outside of Portland. He had last been seen hitchhiking the day before. He had been drugged with Valium, stripped nude, hogtied, and strangled with his own shoelaces. Now his camera, inscribed with his initials, would later be found in Randy's home. The very next day, the body of an unknown male, estimated to be between 35 and 45, was found dumped just a few miles from where Michael was found. He had also been strangled and stripped nude. Now, sadly, his identity has never been established, and he remains known only as Portland Elk Doe. In late August, Randy returned to Long Beach, California, and not long after, on September 3rd, 1980, the nude and hogtied decomposing body of a 19-year-old Marine named Robert Loggins was found wrapped in a trash bag near the El Toro Marine Base. He was estimated to have been dead for about a week, and a cause of death was unable to be determined due to the level of decomp. He had last been seen on August 22nd by several of his fellow Marines attempting to hitchhike into town to go drink. Now, during a later autopsy, a sock was found inserted into his rectum, and a cord was found in the bag alongside his body. On top of this, his blood alcohol level was also found to be extremely high, and despite being found, hogtied in a trash bag, the coroner listed his cause of death as accidental overdose, and his case was closed as a, quote, accidental death. Again, you gotta love what your tax dollars are paying here. He hogtied himself, put himself in a bag, and accidentally died of an overdose. Now, it wouldn't be until 3 years later, after Randy was caught, that Polaroids would be found in his possession, all of them depicting Robert Loggins passed out on his couch and in various stages of undress and in suggestive poses. It's unknown if Robert was alive or dead when these photos were taken. Now, on April 10th, 1980, the nude body of a 17-year-old named Michael Cluck was found off Interstate 5 near Oregon. He had been brutally beaten before his death, suffering 31 blows to the back of the head, ultimately dying from blunt force trauma. He had been sodomized with a foreign object and burned all over his body. He was covered from head to toe in blood, and investigators described his murder as a frenzy. 4 months later, on August 20th, 1981, the body of a 17-year-old sex worker named Christopher Williams would be found in the San Bernardino Mountains, having had tissues rammed so far up his nose that he choked to death on his own mucus. So we're seeing some horrifically, it's just so brutal.
And he seems to be like trying new stuff to see what he likes, which is horrible. The deaths are already horrible and everything, but he's like basically trying to perfect what he wants.
And he is. I think that's what he's doing. Obviously he gets off on sadism, and I think he's just like, I'm going to try this to see if it gets me off sexually. If it doesn't, then I'll try something else on the next victim. Now, it is known around this time that the relationship between Randy and Jeff was souring, and the two were starting to get in frequent fights, often over Randy staying gone at all hours of the night. These fights again correlated to when Randy would go for drives to cool off and more bodies would end up being found. On July 29th, two bodies were found side by side off the Rampart Boulevard off-ramp. The body of 13-year-old Raymond Davis was found nude and strangled with his own shoelaces, and the body of 16-year-old Robert Alvilla just a few feet away from Raymond. Both had been estimated to have been there for about a week. Now he's doing two at a time, which is terrifying.
And children.
And it's getting younger. And that's, again, he has no victim profile. He kills people from 13-year-olds all the way to people in their 40s. After this, though, Randy would cool off for several more months before on November 1st, 1982, he abducted and killed a 24-year-old hitchhiker named Arn Lane, whose body would not be found until January of 1984. On December 3rd of that same year, the nude and tortured body of 29-year-old Anthony Silverera was found off the side of a freeway in Medford. He had been sodomized with a foreign object and strangled. Just a few days later, Randy would board a flight to Grand Rapids, Michigan for a business trip and again claim more victims. On December 9th, the bodies of two cousins, 24-year-old Dennis Alt and 20-year-old Christopher Shoeborn, were found fully nude off the side of the highway. They had been displayed in a sexually suggestive position, and both bore signs of torture and beating before death. Dennis had died from an accidental drug overdose, and Christopher had been strangled with a belt, but most disturbing of all, and trigger warning for anyone with a penis, it was found Christopher had had a ballpoint pen rammed down his urethra before death. The belongings of both men would later be found in Randy's possession. Now, upon his return from Michigan, Randy wasted no time claiming his next victim as he picked up a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Lance Taggs in Oregon as he was driving home from the airport. Lance's body would be found dumped along the Oregon Highway, having been sodomized and murdered by having a sock rammed down his throat. So again, no chill at all. He's like, I'm going on a business trip. I'm going to see how many people I can murder. I get home. I'm on my way home. Might as well murder again. And it's just picking up, and he's getting very sloppy with it, which thankfully that's how he gets caught. You get sloppy with it and gets cocky. But it's the fact that he seems to be escalating even after police are so close to him. Like, they have his name, and he's already been arrested once in connection with a similar murder. And tensions are already high because two other killers have just been caught. So while Randy was starting to ramp up his killing spree, and by this point seemed to be getting cocky with how brazen he was, investigators were slowly starting to put together the pieces, starting in Oregon. The murders of all of Randy's known Oregon victims were quickly linked by investigators due to their similarities, and they quickly established that the killer must have lived out of state and only killed there while on business. Working with investigators in California, the two murder sprees were quickly linked, and it was determined that a third freeway killer was still at large, and now the hunt was back on. And this leads us to 1983, the year Randy's reign of terror would finally come to an end, but not before he claimed at least several more victims. And all the ones we're going through, those are only his confirmed ones. Like I said, there's probably at least 20 to 30, maybe more, that he did kill and he's not saying anything. Police haven't found or been able to link him to it. So just, he's even more active than what this episode portrays. And how he finds the time to do it is another thing. So on January 27th, 1983, he would abduct a 21-year-old hitchhiker named Eric Church. He had been sodomized, beaten over the head, and strangled before being dumped from a moving vehicle. On February 12th, Randy would abduct two friends as they walked home from a friend's house party, 18-year-old Jeffrey Nelson and 20-year-old Robert Duvall. Both had been stripped nude, sodomized, castrated, and finally killed by being strangled before their bodies were dumped in a ditch along Mount Baldy in San Bernardino. And with that, we end up back to where we started this case at the beginning of part 1 last week. Randy would be pulled over on May 14th, and the dead body of his final victim, 25-year-old Marine Terry Gramble, would be found in the passenger seat, with Randy quickly being arrested. Now, as Randy was taken into custody, his car was searched as well as his home, as officers collected multiple pieces of evidence, including tranquilizers, tape, blood splatter all over the inside of his car, over 100 photographs showing young men either dead or knocked out as Randy molested them, and several of his victims were shown to have been in these photos. Most chilling and damning of all, however, was a large binder which contained a long list of cryptic words and numbers, along with some having outright names of young men who were either found murdered or disappeared over the last decade. This led to the conclusion that this was a scorecard of how Randy kept track of his victims. Some entries had initials, which investigators matched to several victims. Some entries simply had words describing locations or features of the victim or where they were picked up, like Marine or Westminster area, or even just how violent the murder had been, such as one entry labeled simply bloody. Some also referred to double kills Randy committed, such as one entry labeled 2 for 1 hitchhikers. Some of Randy's confirmed victims were also found not to have been listed in the scorecard, which meant that it wasn't actually that meticulous. So all this led investigators to the conclusion that there are upwards of 70 plus victims of Randy Kraft. There were 61 names listed on the scorecard. Well, like I said, not all of his victims that were confirmed to be his were on it, which means it wasn't a meticulous list that he kept really good track of.
And he seemed to be changing all the time, too. It's like part of them are cryptic, part of them are outright just tells you the name.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like he was just like a wild card all over the place.
And he was. And so, again, that's why investigators are like, it's like at least 70.
And honestly, I could see where like a wild card would be a lot harder to catch than somebody that's stuck to like a rigid way they killed, type they killed, area they killed, so that's probably why he was the last of the 3 caught, and still only caught because of a DUI.
Because of his own carelessness. Now, by May 16th, 1983, Randy was formally charged with first-degree murder, among other charges, but due to how complex the evidence was in some cases compared to others, Randy would only ever be charged for the murders of 16 of his victims, although he definitely killed many more than that. His trial would begin on September 26, 1988, and throughout all of it, Randy maintained his innocence and stated that he never killed anybody, including the man in his car the night he was arrested. Despite having been strangled to death being determined as the cause of death, Randy stated that part was consensual, and Terry died of an accidental drug overdose. His defense stuck by his innocence too, pointing out that much of the evidence was technically circumstantial, with the pictures not actually proving he was the one who murdered them, because many weren't able to determine. We can't tell if they are dead or if they're just passed out. Now, they also took advantage of the fact 2 other serial killers were operating at the same time and stated that it was more than likely that they killed the majority of the victims that the prosecution claimed Randy murdered. Despite the fact, many victims continued to pile up for 3 years after the last freeway killer was caught. So it's okay. Yes, you can kind of do the plausible deniability, like the victims all the way up until the second freeway killer was caught. Like, if you don't have any actual physical evidence to tie Randy to them, how can you prove that it wasn't one of the other 2? But the fact that they continued to pile up after the second one was caught, it's kind of hard to refute that. Now, Randy's trial caused such a media frenzy, it would last for 13 months and become the most expensive trial in Oregon state history before finally on May 12th, 1989, almost 6 years to the date that he was caught, the jury left to deliberate and returned after 11 days with a verdict.
11 days?
11 days, but also you have to take into account they're going through the charges of at least 16 victims. And so it's a process, like, do we charge them death penalty for all these.
Okay, that makes a little more sense.
Also, there are other charges like sodomy, kidnapping, rape, stuff like that. So it was about, there was, the reason it took so long was because there were so many charges to go through.
It wasn't because they were deliberating whether he was innocent or guilty.
No. So finally, they found Randy guilty on 16 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of sodomy, and 1 count of emasculation, which meant 1 count of castration, which I didn't know it was its own thing, but yes, it is. On August 11th, Randy was sentenced to death. Following his conviction, Randy underwent several medical studies and CT scans to possibly diagnose what might be wrong with him to cause him to be so brutal. And one scan did reveal that Randy suffered damage to his frontal lobe, which caused him to be unable to control his impulses and his emotions. But despite this, I'm like, yeah, okay, that explains, kind of. It explains why he made so many rash, brutal decisions. Doesn't excuse anything he did, so he's still going to rot in jail. But even after this, and also despite being put behind bars and on death row, the case didn't end there, as there was still the lingering question of whether or not Randy had an accomplice, which according to several pieces of evidence, he would have had to. Along with 2 sets of footprints found in the sand at the scene of one murder, investigators also found it unlikely Randy was able to throw several of his victims out of a high-speed moving car if he was the one driving. On top of this, semen was found on the body of Eric Church, which did not match Randy's and was from an unidentified male. Prosecutors would even later admit that they held back from charging Randy with several murders because the evidence pointed to there being more than one killer. Who this accomplice could have been has remained a hot topic of debate over the years, with 2 more than likely suspects coming to mind. The first being Randy's first lover, Jeff Graves. Now, Jeff was with Randy for 16 of his murders and even provided Randy with an alibi for Keith Crotwell's murder, which is what got him released. Jeff remained tight-lipped about his relationship with Randy and never discussed his knowledge about Randy's actions. By the time investigators got enough to formally question him, bring him in for questioning, Jeff passed away in 1987 from AIDS. In 2000, author of the Randy Kraft book, Angel of Darkness, put forth the theory that a criminal named Bob Jackson admitted to him that he had actually murdered 2 hitchhikers with Randy and that there were many more police didn't know about that weren't on the scorecard. Now, again, despite trying to go to police with this information to have them investigate, no evidence was actually found to charge Bob with anything. And so while it is known that Randy had to have had an accomplice for at least some of his murders, no actual evidence to determine who that may be has ever come forward.
Or honestly, how many. He could have multiple accomplices. This man was wily and up to a lot of stuff.
But also, it's very terrifying to think and remember that there's still a killer out there who got away with it.
Oh, yeah.
No one knows who, and that's why we always say stay dangerous out there. Now, aside from the potential accomplices, there's also at least 17 entries on Randy's scorecard that have been unaccounted for and possibly represent various other victims that could be anywhere across several states. Over the years, various cold cases, unsolved murders of young men, and John Does have been investigated as being possible victims of Randy Kraft, with some investigations being as recent as 2024. Despite this, sadly, not much in the way of evidence has been uncovered to definitively link him to any more murders. Randy himself remains alive on death row at San Quentin State Prison, and to this day, he maintains his innocence and refuses to admit anything in relation to the countless murders he committed over the years. And that is kind of the full story of Randy Kraft, aka the Scorecard Killer. But as you can see by the end of it, there's still a lot of unanswered questions. And hopefully one day those come out, someone comes forward, someone has to know something. I didn't go into all the potential cases investigators think that Randy's linked to but hasn't been charged with, like all the cold cases and John Does and unsolved murders, because we would be here for a long time. But that, again, that just goes to show you how prolific he was, how brutal he was, how active he was, and the fact that he definitely had at least some people helping him during a few of them. is terrifying to think about. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. I know that was a rough one. I know when we usually do these really brutal serial killers, it can be a lot. I think you have a few palate cleansers coming in the next few weeks. I know my next episode is actually going to be a queer history episode. And I think Brad.
I have a queer history episode. It is a true crime episode, but also a lot of queer history that I'm really excited to present to Jordy.
So yes, I think for the next 2 weeks, you guys are going to get a little bit of a reprieve from the really heavy stuff. It's still going to be true crime related, but it is more so queer history. So you guys got that to look forward to. And with that, thank you guys so much. Hopefully you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please leave us a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot, helps other people discover the podcast. And of course, we just love hearing from you guys. If you want to see photos from today's case, you can follow us on Instagram at beerswithqueerspod, that's P-O-D, or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. And until next week, stay dangerous out there, my friend.
See you soon.